to welcome you to this very special series, which we've entitled Rising Sun Remembers. We're celebrating our 130th anniversary, so we've gathered together several guests that we thought might give some insight into the history of Rising Sun Church of Christ. And we start, first of all, today with a very special friend. Mate Mason is, 98 years old. I told her we shouldn't ask a lady her age, but she said she's proud of it. And her maiden name was Weaver. And so, Mate, I'm going to ask you just some very simple questions about some of your memories of Rising Sun. I guess one that I remember is, why don't you tell us a little bit about the mouse and the communion service?
Well, it was at the communion service, and the minister was standing up there, and I was in the choir on the front row, of course, and a little mouse came out, played around, and jumped up on his leg. I thought it sure would go on up, but it didn't. But it went on down, went up on the cloth, the communion table, and went up on and got on the communion table, and you could see up there, and it got on the bread, and in the middle of the bread, and would eat, raise up to eat, you know. And so my mother nearly killed me when I got home because we laughed so at communion service.
Oh, I imagine they were horrified to think a mouse had been nibbling on the communion bread.
They didn't know why we were laughing. When we told them, they laughed too.
Yes, I suppose in those days, laughing in church wasn't exactly permissible,
brother,
was it?
No.
Another story you've told me that I thought was fairly interesting was the preachers in those early days came out from Des Moines. Why don't you tell us about the procedure and then about the individual who forgot his toothbrush?
Well, my mother always would say to the preacher who came out, now, if anyone doesn't ask you for dinner, why, remember that our home is always open. And so we always had somebody nearly always for dinner, some preacher. But the one time we had a preacher from Drake come out. He was a young student, and he was from Canada. And so he come out, and he stayed all night at our place. And the next morning when he got up, he looked around and he said, I don't have a toothbrush, could I borrow yours? And I was shocked, but I said, why sure, and I let him have my toothbrush, but I never used it again.
Threw it out, huh?
And a lot of experiences with preachers.
Yes, I was thinking you also told me that when you and your late husband were married, you were married in the parsonage up in Altoona, and the preacher there was Frederick Kirshner.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that situation?
Well, Dr. Kirshner, is one of the most wonderful men. And we were married in the University Church at the altar, just us and our witnesses all. But Kirshner was a wonderful person, and I don't know that there's much to tell about because.
Now he later taught at Drake, didn't he?
He was an instructor at Drake at that time.
I see.
And then a minister at the Altoona Church.
Anybody that has studied a little bit of the history of the Christian Church, the Church of Christ, will recognize that name because he did quite a bit of writing.
Dr. Kirshner was a wonderful man.
Yes. I was wondering if you can recall your date of baptism here.
Yes, I do. I remember it was a revival meeting, and I'm not sure, I think W.J. Hasty was holding the meeting. Anyway, he emphasized that you wasn't going to heaven unless you were baptized, and I really wanted to go to heaven.
Yes.
So I was baptized that meeting.
Were there several at that meeting?
Yes, several. But the biggest meeting we had, was with Frank Hay Lemon.
Oh, is that
and
right?
there were over 100 converts at that meeting.
100.
Over 100, and I don't know whether I should put this on television, but Little Methodist Church,
Mm-hmm.
we got so many from there that they had to close.
Is that right? Now, how long was the meeting?
I think about at least 4 weeks.
Those they used to call them protracted meetings.
Oh yes, they were protracted.
Because they just went on, they went on, they went on. That's what it meant. How about also you told me the little piece that you said in Sunday school,
yes.
I believe, when you were about 3 years old?
At Christmas program, I would have been 5 in January, and this is a Christmas program. And my mother taught the youngsters at home their piece to speak, and so I had a little piece, but I was not supposed to speak. So I kept saying, I want to speak my piece. And Billy Shivers was superintendent, and he sat right next to us. And every time anybody would get up, I'd say, I want to speak my piece. But I'd say, shh, you don't have any piece. But anyway, finally, Billy Shivers just announced a recitation Maida Weaver. And brother, I was down off my mother's lap before she could catch me. And I went up on the platform and made my bow. And I happened to remember I had my mouth full of gum, because they always, at Christmas treats, they always gave us a stick of gum.
So you had your treat
and
already.
I had my gum already. And so I thought about that, and I couldn't talk very well with my gum in my mouth, so I went back and stuck it on the casing of that archway they had. I went back and spoke my piece, and it was, I'm a little sunbeam, a tiny ray of light. I'll try to do all I can to make this world more bright. I went back and got my gum, put it in my mouth, went down.
Is that right? I'd say that's pretty good for about 95 years. You remember that piece that you gave.
I could see myself sticking that gum on that.
Well, now, I understand that you played the piano in the church for quite a while.
Well, we had the organ, first, of course, and when I was about 12 years old, the organist didn't come, and Winderode was superintendent. I can't think what his name is now. But anyway, he came back and he said, Maida, wouldn't you like to play the organ today? And oh, I was thrilled to death. I thought that was wonderful, because I could play any old thing I ever heard by ear. I went up and played, and the first thing I played was Bring Them In, and those three little grace notes, you know how nice that was. And so after that I played the organ for years, and I got a beautiful gold watch and chain for playing the organ one time. Here.
I suppose that you would recommend very highly that young people get started serving in the local church like that?
Early.
Very important, isn't it?
And I do think that we older people shouldn't crowd them out.
Yes, the importance of Christian training in the home.
That's right.
And the adult example is very vital. Just kind of in conclusion here in this segment of Our Rising Sun Remembers, would there be any message that you might like to just say in terms of your testimony about Christ and what He's meant in your life in these some 98 years?
Well, that's meant everything to me. And if anyone doesn't want to follow Christ, why, it's their problem. Because what is there ahead of us if we don't?
Yes. I would say that's had your convictions have had a lot to do with your positive attitude you seem to carry all these years. Well, we want to say a big thank you for these few moments in this particular segment, and we just look forward to some more of those stories that you can relate to us concerning the heritage of. On this segment of Rising Sun Remembers, we're talking with Frank Person, and Frank told me just before we started that he was about 14 years old when he was baptized, and he thought that was about 73 years ago. Do you remember anything about the circumstances? Was it a revival meeting, or was it just a Sunday service when you made your confession of faith and were baptized, Frank?
Oh, no, it was a revival meeting.
Do you recall how long it was? Was it what they call a protracted meeting?
Oh, I suppose they were on a week or maybe 2 weeks. They had some good ones those days.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Did they have a visiting preacher come in and
Oh,
preach
yes,
and
they always were.
that kind of thing?
It wasn't a local preacher.
I was wondering too, you were active in a group they called the MPA, the Mutual Protective Association, I believe. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, there's much thievery going on. You know, in those days you'd see outfit driving down the road and all covered wagons things. I mean, well, maybe they camped in the schoolyard, you know, somebody they didn't know, but they always had company. Usually some of those fellows watching them.
Oh, yes.
They had this organization they watched. It was all chicken stealing and harnessing, something like that. In those days, I don't know if they ever caught anything or not, but anyway, that was the starting of it.
Kind of interesting, we've kind of come full circle, because here, 4 or 5 years ago in this community, there was so much theft that they began to have kind of a little group that began to look out for each other. So it's kind of a throwback of the old days.
Yeah, it was that. But of course now you hear and gone.
Yes. I just wondered if you, in bringing our history up to date, a little bit. I was wondering about some of the circumstances surrounding some of the war years. If you remember anything, did the church activities change very much during the war years, World War I, World War II, or maybe the later wars? Anything that comes to mind about the servicemen or how the church reacted during those times?
Well, I don't remember too much except Lloyd Brady's brother Arliss was in the service, and through the media some way anyway, we knew there was a big drive coming up, see, real soon. And one Sunday, they called people together, and Sunday afternoon they had prayer session.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I remember that one.
Anything in particular about the 1920s, maybe, the Great Depression, and maybe how it affected the church that you'd want to comment on?
Well, I don't know how much it affected the church, but at that time there wasn't much money changing hands in the church.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Brother Grossknuckle was preaching, and I don't know what they paid him, not very much, I don't think, and there wasn't much demand on money, as I remember then. Of course, got into depression, wasn't much money coming from anywhere.
So the church felt the squeeze of that,
Oh,
I'm
evidently
sure.
it had to.
Of course, in the early years, too, the life of the community kind of centered in the church. Do you recall activities that, church activities that were really more community-minded? Because I know then there was a lot more activity at church in terms of community, because people didn't travel, they didn't have TV, they didn't have radio.
No, I can remember they seemed like there was a church picnic once in a while, and as years went on, they had the old Coliseum. The ladies ate once or twice a year. They'd have chicken suppers. They were famous for those chicken suppers. But evidently there were more activities than I too well acquainted with.
Yes, now bringing things up a little more recently, now you were kind of in charge of the finance committee, I believe, when the present building that we're in, that was built in 1965, you did some research and kind of went to bat for the church to get some money borrowed to build a building, didn't you?
Yeah, Charlie Meacham and I. Charlie was into that.
Okay. I wondered too, is there any particular preacher that comes to mind of those old days that you might want to comment on?
Well, I don't know, there should be, but I don't seem to remember too many. Remember, we had one in the neighborhood, you know.
Yes, I think that was...
D.R. Ellis.
Yes, Brother Ellis. Why don't you tell us a little bit about him?
Well, of course, I was just a child when that was going on, but he must have been kind of an evangelist. I know he traveled around, and I think his boys took care of the farming.
Oh.
Once in a while, he'd come here and he'd tell us that he'd announce ahead to see what he's going to talk about the next Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Us kids about my age, we knew he was good for an hour and a half.
Is that right?
We saw that too.
Well, hour and a half sermons, that takes some adjustment for all of us, wouldn't it?
That's right. But he preached around over different places. I can remember seeing him drive down to Camp Center. That was about 5 miles from here. He and his wife on a Sunday morning, he preached there part-time. He was one of the old-time ministers.
Uh-huh. I was wondering too if maybe any Sunday school teachers, elders or deacons that come to mind in those days when you were growing up that maybe had an influence on the young people or stood out as somebody rather special to you?
Yes. Pearl Weaver, that's Esther's dad.
Okay.
He was one that I always kind of looked up to. Her grandfather also.
I see.
He was kind of a quiet man, but you get him alone. He's kind of an idol of mine. So was Mate an idol of mine.
Yes.
She's about 10 years older than I was.
Well, that's, I find that very interesting because many times you visit with people and about everybody can point to somebody that seemingly has really made an influence. And like you said, a lot of times it's not necessarily somebody that's talkative. It might be a quiet person, but their lifestyle and example meant a whole lot.
This Grandpa Weaver, he was a little that way. He wasn't the one that was always up in front of the church talking, as I remember, but I happened to be with him the next day after service, you know. He'd say, "Now, I look at it this way."
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
He was very interesting.
I know in the number of years you've been here, Frank, there have been a lot of changes Does anything come to mind that maybe is a drastic change or something that has that really stands out in those early years as opposed to coming to church and being a part of this church now?
Well, of course, my folks moved here about 7 years old,
Mm-hmm.
so it was just a natural thing. They come to church, and of course I was along too.
You followed along.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a
And
good
there
number
were
of
various
years.
preachers. I don't recall their names, but we had one especially, a brother Hasty.
Mm-hmm. I hear that name quite
He
often.
was an older man.
Of course, as Maid told us, in earlier years, the preachers came from Drake University a lot of times.
Yeah.
And didn't really have a full-time preacher for
No,
those
hardly
years.
ever till finally Ellie Grossnick would come along, and he just stayed and kept staying, and that was the
Yeah.
whole thing.
I believe that was about 1942, wasn't it?
It could have been along there somewhere. Mm-hmm.
To kind of conclude things, Frank, is there anything that you might just tell us in terms of the influence the church has had on on your life and your family?
Well, I suppose we've lived kind of Christian lives. I've never been in any great trouble, I guess.
Uh-huh.
My mother worked in the church. She was a strong worker in the Ladies' Aid, which used to be something that was quite active. And my wife, first wife Hazel, she was a member here.
So it's just kind of been a part of life for you.
I guess it has
in one
kind
way
of
to
been
say.
that way, yeah.
Well, again, we'd like to say a big thank you to Frank Person on this day of our taping of segments of history from the past and our series called Rising Sun Remember. Our guest is Phyllis Shivers on this segment of Rising Sun Remembers. And I guess I'd start first of all by asking Phyllis, I think in conversation earlier you said that your grandparents were members here. Why don't you tell us their name, and let's just kind of trace down to some of your folks.
Well, their name was Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Gray, and they lived where Leo Griffins live now. That was their home.
Okay. Now how close is that to the church building?
Well, one was a mile and a half,
About
probably.
a mile and a half, okay.
And my parents were Mr. and Mrs. W.V. Waller, William Vance Waller, and they lived, at the time I was born, they lived with my grandparents. But when I was a year old, my father bought 80 acres, and so we moved over there, and we lived there until I was married in 1924, and I married Raymond Shivers, and we had 4 children.
Let's just kind of inject right here. I believe you told me one time that you and your late husband Raymond both were baptized the same day.
Yes, the same day in December of 1917.
Now, I was kind of wondering, was there a revival meeting going
Yes,
on?
there was a revival meeting, and I had been thinking about it, and that night, I guess God just urged me to step out and go forward.
Isn't that
And I was
something?
baptized in the old church. It was in December.
Well, it's cold
It
night
was cold.
probably.
It was really cold.
And I suppose you had no knowledge that Raymond was going to go forward that night at all.
No, we just didn't even hardly know each other.
Yeah, and as you look back later years, I bet you thought that was quite a blessing to both of you have made that
yes, that's
confession.
true. Uh-huh.
Now tell us, let's go then from your family on down. You were telling me about the number of generations that currently attend here.
Well, my parents did, and Raymond and I did, and our 4 children did, but at the present time I have 2 sons, Harold and Ralph, and I have 7 grandchildren. Do I need to name them?
Oh, yeah, why don't you give us a name?
Well, there's Ralph's children, Carla and Keith and Carla and Kent and Kurt, and then there was Harold's children, and that's Nancy Rogers and Larry Shivers, and our oldest son's son, that's Ronnie Shivers.
Yes.
And then I have 5 great-grandchildren that come to Rising Sun, and the oldest one of the grandchildren is 13, and her name is Kelly Shivers. She was baptized, a year or so ago.
Well, it was Easter time, if I
Yes, it
remember
was
right.
Easter time in the new church.
Yes. Well, that, I believe you said that's 6 generations.
That is 6 generations that are regular attendants, I might say,
Yes.
at the Rising Sun Church of Christ.
Well, I would say for a grandma and for parents that that's surely a blessing to have family retained in the local church like you've had.
Well, I'm very proud of all of them.
I'm sure you are. Well, that's great. I just wondered if, so I guess we could say that you've lived virtually all of your life in this community then.
Yes, I have.
Is there,
Practically all my life in Clay Township. We
Is
just
that
never
right?
moved around much.
no need to go any place when you like where you live?
No, it was home.
Sure. Is there anything that you would mention maybe concerning, I've asked some of the other folks about the social life as the church was concerned. It seemed like in the older days a lot of activities centered in the church. How would you describe some of those
Well,
activities?
we had lots of nice times. We had every winter during the holidays, we'd have an oyster supper at some of the people's homes. And in the summer, we would have, in June, we would have strawberries and ice cream social somewhere.
That sounds good.
And an annual Sunday school picnic every summer. And that was lots of nice get-togethers,
Oh, I'm
social
sure.
times.
A lot of good memories of
Yes,
a lot of people.
that's right. That was a long time ago.
Well, that's the kind of thing we want to capture on this taping, is some of those activities. I wondered if you remembered any of the changes that have taken place in the church in terms of, we've come television and radio and telephones and that kind of thing as concerned in those years with the church. You recall anything specific about those inventions as they might involve the church?
Well, we had had a radio. I don't know what year it was now, but we didn't have electricity, and it was until 1930. But in the old church building, I remember our communion service. We had a table, I think it was a library table, with white covers over the table, and then our communion trays there. And then we had a white cover that covered that. And when we were at the old church, the deacons' wives took care of the communion, and we divided up 1 month a year. And I took care of the communion for 25 years. That is 1 month a year. But the deacons' wives did that then.
They shared in the whole
And it was a
process.
good job to keep those linens washed and clean and ironed and back on there. But when we come to the new church, we didn't do that no more.
I was going to say, and those would have been in the days when you all baked the
Yes.
unleavened bread.
Yes.
And if
Well, I didn't do that. They bought the bread.
They bought the bread,
Yes.
I see. I know some of the churches, they baked it, and it was so
Yes.
hard to get it just right. You get it too brown or not
Well,
done enough.
I didn't do that. They bought it
I
at
see.
that time.
Well, that was a job because, it's important to our services that we always have the communion every Sunday.
Oh,
and
yes.
I think sometimes we fail to realize how much work goes into it.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. And still today, there's lots of work that go
Yes.
in. I'm glad we got capable people.
Yes, that's a real blessing. One other thing I would ask you, I've heard several of the folks your age say that Rising Sun has always had a number of young people.
Yes, I agree with that.
I take it that there was always a group activity and young people that hung around together and must have enjoyed their life in the church.
Well, I know when I was young, I believe that was about the time we got married, we had the SBI class. And I can't remember whether we were the originators of that class or not, but it was, SPI stood for Spiritual, Progressive, and Intellectual. And 7 couples, there was quite a few of our age, there were 7 couples of that class that got married in 23 and 24.
Is
And
that
to
right?
this day, there's 3 of those couples that are still living. 60-year anniversary.
Boy, that's a special blessing, especially time like this.
And we had a wonderful Sunday school teacher, and his name was Pearl Weaver.
Pearl Weaver, yes, that name has come up before.
We-
Well, we want to say thank you to Phyllis today for the insight into some of those earlier years, and we just look forward to more of the history of Rising Sun Church of Christ. Our guest is Alta Caldwell, and Alta, I noticed in the notes that you gave me that you said you were about 6 years old when your folks moved back to this community and you started a Sunday school. Do you have any recollection of some of those early years in Sunday school that you might want to share with us?
Well, the first Sunday that I came here, I was always so short for my age that they took me and put me in the smallest class because they didn't think I could read.
You got in the wrong class to start
I was
with.
in Maud Davis's class. And they found out I could read, so they put me over the next Sunday in Grandma Weaver's class.
So you got a promotion in just about 1 week.
And yes.
Well, I wondered too, you mentioned also that almost every year, I've asked several of the people this question, there were protracted meetings. Now, I believe in your notes you said something about they had, what, 2 a year, was that right?
No, I don't believe so.
What was that about protracted? Well, what do you remember about those meetings that might be of interest to some of our folks?
Well, we pretty near always tried to attend the meetings at night, that with the protracted meetings. And my dad would, it was long in the spring when a couple of different times there, and
Okay.
the roads were so muddy they didn't have any kind of preparations on them at all. And he hitched a team up to the big old lumber wagon. We'd start out with our family, and we'd take John Johnson's family and Willie Peters' family that lived there close to us, and start out that way. If we'd catch up with anyone walking, why, they'd get into, and we certainly had to load when we got there.
Well, we've had some pretty bad weather this winter. In fact, one of our members said they could count about 3 really good Sundays that we've had this year, and yet, even in spite of that, we find out that people years ago hitched up the team and went through mud and even walked to church.
Yeah, they even walked to, I walked to church a good many days from living down in Hawkins Lane down there.
Is that right? Well,
Most generally, that was generally our way coming as kids.
I've asked several of the folks about activities at the church. Anything that you would recall about activities in terms of picnics or that kind of thing that might come to mind?
Well, they used to years ago have a picnic every summer down here in Ellis Grove. And they generally had an ice cream social, ice cream strawberry
Oh,
in the
yes.
spring. And they, as a rule, they generally had an oyster supper in the winter.
In your notes, you mentioned 2 of the preachers. We've heard a little bit about D.R. Ellis previously, but you mentioned Brother Lowe. Would you want to comment on him as a preacher, something you remember about?
He preached here for quite a long while, and there's one thing I remember about him so much. He most generally called for "God Will Take Care of You" for the invitation hymn.
Is that right?
That was the first hymn then that I learned to play on the organ.
Huh. Yes, I noticed that you mentioned that that was one of his favorites. Also, in those days, I believe that lots of times, did the men and women sit on opposite sides of the church, or did they sit together?
Well, they didn't sit together too much because when they came in for Sunday school, the men had their class on the west side of the aisle there, and the ladies had on the east side of the main aisle of the old church.
Oh,
Lots of times they just stayed there for church too.
rather than moving, I suppose. Now, also, were the Sunday school classes separated, boys and girls, or were they
Oh,
together?
yes. They were separated.
I see.
Had the tiny classes together. And then they had the little girls class from about time they learned to read up to 12 years old. And then they went to the young ladies class till they were married.
Oh,
And the
okay.
boys were the same way.
Huh. That's interesting. Also about the area around here, I believe you mentioned there was a store and a blacksmith shop. Anything? Would you want to give us a little bit of the setting around the church building in some of those earlier days?
Well, just what I was saying.
Well, you mentioned, was there more than just a blacksmith shop?
Well,
A store?
years ago there was, but when the time I was coming here, most all of it had disappeared.
That dwindled down.
But when my mother was small, she talked about it being such a big town.
Okay. Well, we'd understood that Rising Sun was a thriving community.
Yes, it was.
Up until about the time the railroad came through is what I've understood.
Mhm.
And
The railroad went through Altoona then, when the town just pretty near completely broke up.
kind of a shift of the population.
Mhm.
Wondered also if you recalled life in the church during maybe the war years or the Great Depression. Is there anything that sticks out? Did things change very much, or was life pretty much as usual in the church, even though we had some tough times?
Well, during the Depression years, I was down helping at Woodland, and I didn't attend here, only just once in a
That's
while
right.
I'd come up at night. But when we moved at Woodland, the church had closed up, there was no church, and there were so many little tots around there
Mhm.
that there was about 4 or 5 of us ladies thought we should get those children in Sunday school at least.
Mhm.
So we organized a Sunday school there and got them started there. And after a while, some of the men started coming in, and we finally got enough to organize a church. And that's the way this last Church of Christ started down there.
Well, it's quite a testimony to the value of Sunday school. You know,
That's right.
sometimes Sunday school classes are called ineffective and even wasted time, but you can see the impact that it's had.
Yes, it has.
Is there any Sunday school teacher maybe that kind of sticks out in your mind that you had during the years?
Well, when I was little, Grandma Weaver was my main teacher up until I started into the other class, and then Matey took over, and I'd say those 2 teachers are pretty clear in my
Left
mind.
a impact upon your life. I wondered also if we talked about a lot with various people about protracted meetings. I've heard some of of course, the 4-week meetings. Do you remember that would be any longer than 4 week?
No, I don't believe I
About
do.
that line. Oh, there have been talk of some 6-week meetings in other churches. I didn't know whether they ever had them out here or not.
I don't remember them going that long.
And you talked of your experience down at Woodland Hills. About how long were you there and helping the folks get going?
Well, we started there when Wilma Jane was about 4 years old, I think. We decided they should be in Sunday school. And then we stayed and tried to get them the church organized and all until it pretty near broke up. They was trying to get a different denomination in there.
Oh, yes.
And so they got Joe to take our membership in there so he could be in as a deacon and help override that
Uh-huh.
different change.
Uh-huh.
And he had a membership in there about a year, I guess. And then they got these little, what they called elder deacons in.
Oh.
And they were just about 12 years old. And they were bound, they let them vote right along with the big people.
Oh, I see.
And they were bound, they were gonna hire a Baptist minister.
I see.
And so they overruled that. And we stayed there then until, after Wilma Jane was married, when Steve was just a baby. And they let her come home from the hospital early, and she was down to my place. I was taking care of her then, and they made her go to bed. And Joe went to church on Sunday night, and I didn't go. And the next morning, that minister came down and he raked over me because I wasn't at church.
Oh.
I told him I had that daughter in bed and the baby to take care of. I thought was more
Sure.
good there than in church. And he says, well, your place was up there at the church where you belong.
Oh.
So-
Pretty strong stuff.
That made Joseph sore at that minister. The next Sunday, we came to Rising Sun and put our membership back in
You
here.
came back. Well, we sure have enjoyed our visit with Alpha Caldwell on this segment of Rising Sun Remembers, and again, we look forward to hearing more of some of the circumstances surrounding those years. Our guest on this segment of Rising Sun Remembers is Lloyd and Pauline Brady. First of all, I want to ask each of you a little bit about your family background. We'll go ladies first. We'll start with Pauline. A little bit about your coming to Rising Sun or your family and that type of thing.
Well, when I first came to the church, I was 8 years old. But the thing that really brought us into the church was one time when our house burned down. We weren't very faithful members until then, and we had a fire and it destroyed everything we had. And the church people came to our rescue and they brought clothes, money, furniture, everything.
Is that
And
right?
from then on, we were in the church.
Well, once again, the benevolent and the outreach of caring Christian people really does come through.
Definitely.
Wanted to ask too, I believe you told me that your father was an elder here in later
Yes.
years
Yes,
and took an active part that
yes.
way.
And he taught a Sunday school class for years too.
Okay. Lloyd, how about you? I've heard you talk about the Brady's coming to Rising Sun. Why don't you give us a little summary of that particular situation?
Well, I suppose they date back to the late 60s or the early 70s. They moved here from Warsaw, Indiana, as I told you the other night. And 13 kids in a covered wagon. They settled here in the Rising Sun vicinity. And they went to church here until the family partly grew up and they scattered. And my dad with his brothers homesteaded in Wyoming. They was out there about, I would say probably 17 years. Then we moved back here in 1923. We lived, at that time, we lived at Berwick for 2 years. And then we moved to the Rising Sun vicinity, and we've been here ever since.
So your family then came, like you said, the 1870s, and then there would have been that 17-year period when they were in Wyoming, but then they came back to Rising Sun, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, the boys were in Wyoming, but there was some of the girls that stayed here and attended, I believe, continually here, because my Aunt Lib, Uncle Bob Hicks, that would be Dad's sister. Aunt Lib would be Dad's sister. She was a-going here yet when we came back, and I think she lived right over here on 163. And then I had another aunt that stayed here, Aunt Becky Miller, and she came here some, but I don't know how much. But you see, Aunt Lib and Uncle Bob, that is, Aunt Lib would be Bob's wife. They was, I see members here in, let's see, it was 1872.
So you've kind of had a continuous family connection since 1872.
Yeah.
I believe you've told me that the fellow that baptized you was Brother Cooper.
Charlie
and,
Cooper.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the circumstances around your baptism and him as a preacher?
Everybody loved Charlie Cooper. He was here in 27, 28, maybe a little in 25. He came here from, he was taking a kind of a postgraduate work at Drake. He was already quite a preacher, but he was attending Drake at the time. And was 27, I believe, when I was baptized in the Des Moines River down by the old Ford Bridge. We went down there dry and come home wet because there's no place to change clothes. You know, we just piled in the car.
Wrapped a blanket around them.
Oh, yeah.
But we didn't break any ice. It was in the fall.
Still cold though, I'm sure.
It wasn't too hot, no.
Well, I was going to ask, Pauline, you've been active in women's kinds of activities. I believe you mentioned to me earlier that you did quilting and that kind of thing. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the activities of women?
We had a very active women's group. It was called Ladies' Aid in those days. And they made money and helped support the preacher, and we had suppers and met on I believe, twice a month. And we would do quilting for customers, and we charged 2 cents a yard for the thread that we used, and made money that way. And of course, we had the suppers to make money, and that was the big deal. Good fellowship.
Yes.
Large groups came, met in each other's homes.
That was a time when I guess the church probably struggled a little more financially
Oh, yes.
than what it
If we
has in
gave-
recent years.
If we gave $5 toward the preacher's salary, that was quite a bit.
I see. Both of you have been active in years past of working with young people. I wonder if you might comment upon the number of young people Rising Sun has had. I know others have said Rising Sun has characteristically always had a large comment on that particular segment of the church history.
Yes, there was a lot of young people here, as I had said on Sunday night when I was up in front. If we didn't have enough boys for the girls here, we imported some in. I remember four boys or young men that came here from the Ivy vicinity.
Found them a wife then?
Yep,
Oh.
they all got married here, and I started teaching a young folks class before about the time I was 17 years old. Live wire class. There was 10-year-old boys.
Is that what you called it, the live wire class?
Live wire.
Yes.
Oh, what?
Yeah.
They were really live wires, but that was the name
Yeah,
of it.
they was.
Okay.
They was about that age, and then I graduated, I guess, on to the intermediate class, which was girls and boys both,
Okay.
and then finally to the young folks class, which Esty was a teacher, and then I started teaching, and then finally to the adults. I worked my way clear up through to my PhD.
Okay.
Postal digger.
Postal digger. Well, Pauline, how about young people's activities? I'm sure you had a number of them in your home. Is there any particular times that are memorable?
Oh, well, New Year's Eve's parties, I think, is
New Year's
one
Eve.
that we hear the most from.
Yes, I've heard that.
After we were married and set up our own home, why, then we began to have the parties for the kids. And they always came on New Year's Eve, and we played password and various fun games, ate, and had a prayer circle at midnight and a good time.
Just good Christian fellowship
Right.
and fun.
Mhm.
Is there any, I've asked too about preachers, I've asked about some of the older men, the elders, deacons, that might stick out in your memory, Lloyd, that you were subjected to in those earlier days.
Well, I suppose the older ones that I would remember would be Ed Van Horn was a faithful old elder here, Billy Shivers,
Did
my
you-
father, Pauline's father, and Pearl Weaver was,
Oh, yes. And did you remember D.R. Ellis? I
No.
remember him.
no, I don't remember him. I've heard a lot about D.R. Ellis. He was a preacher too, I guess. But there've been some good old faithful elders here that have had some problems, but they stuck with the truth, the word, and as far as I know, this is the only Church of Christ, in this territory in Des Moines that's, say, 30 years old, if you want to say 30, that's never been parted or never divided.
That says a lot about the leadership that was here and the attitude of the people. Pauline, you mentioned Brother Ellis. I know some of the others have commented on him. Does he stick out in your mind as one of the leaders?
Well, he was quite old at the time, as I
Okay.
remember. And maybe some of the others have mentioned too that after the sermon, our Brother Ellis would get up and he'd make a few remarks.
Oh.
For quite a few remarks.
He'd give a lengthy invitation,
Yes.
we could say. Yes, I think that was kind of a common practice here several years ago, because as a youngster I could remember some of the preachers were still doing that at that time.
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering too about social activities at the church. I know we've heard about the oyster supper, and we've heard about the strawberry and ice cream feed that we had in June. Is there anything now? You folks, of course, the old Coliseum would have been a kind of a hub of activity at that time. Is there anything that we could add to those previous activities that took place in Coliseum?
Well, I wasn't thinking of the Coliseum in particular. I was thinking we used to have a bandstand
Oh,
out
okay.
behind the old church.
Mhm.
And we would have ice cream socials back there. And the women would bring their cakes and we'd have homemade ice cream and maybe a short program or something. We did have a band at one time too, not the church, but the
The
community.
community band.
Uh-huh. And I might add this, that the first time I was ever out with Lloyd, he took me home from one of those ice cream socials.
Is that right? Well, I'd say it's a good place to start, having come to something church-related in that respect. I was wondering too if there was any particular hymns. Does any of the hymns come to mind that you sang then that maybe we don't sing too much now? I know that Alta Caldwell mentioned that one of the preachers always offered, I think it was Brother Lowe, his invitation was always, God will take care of you. And I just wonder if there's a hymn or anything like that that might come to mind that you sang then that maybe we don't sing so much now.
Bringing in the sheaves comes to my mind.
Okay,
We
that's
used to use that
old
one a lot.
standard.
Seems like baptisms, we'd sing a lot, Shall We Gather at the River.
Okay.
Actually.
I know, a happy day.
Oh yeah, it's a good song at baptism time. Has there been anything that really stands out in either of your memories as far as change in terms of church from the earlier days till now? Maybe in transportation or what you wore or anything like that that has changed drastically. I know we were told about how some of you came to church with the horse and wagon and the effort that was made, I guess. Do you see anything that maybe has changed immensely in those years you've been around here?
Well, the biggest change is that it seems as though at one time, anybody that lived in this vicinity went to Rising Sun Church. And I think probably the difference then and now, the transportation was so much different. You see, it was pretty slow, even with the Model T. The transportation was pretty slow, and today they come from, what, 30, 40 miles to this congregation.
All communities.
That's a big difference I see.
So it's changed from a community church to
Right.
quite a spread out church.
Now, you was talking about the young people on Sunday afternoon, the boys would get in their old cars and go down the road and maybe meet 5 or 6 girls walking down the road.
Ah.
And they finally talked to them long enough, persuade them to get in the car, go for a little ride or something, you know. It's a lot different than it is today, yeah. Kids today, you know, they'll jump in a car and go 40, 50 miles maybe, but it wasn't possible at that time.
Short extended. How about gas prices back then? Do you recall?
Yeah, they was 10, 11 cents a gallon.
Well, of course, that's a lot of money then.
Sure it was, sure it was.
This, they had 2 gas stations over on Southwest 7th, right across the viaduct, you know. One of them was Coriel, and the other one was a Superior, and they had competition all the time. You drive through over there, you get gas for 10, 11 cents a gallon.
Wow. We could wish those days had returned. Pauline, I should mention too, your maiden name was Traw, and
Right.
you did say that your father served as an elder for some time. And also, you've been active in teaching little kids through the years. Any memories in conclusion here that we might draw on?
When he was talking about teaching them the live wires, I started up, well, we had, 6 classes, I believe, in the auditorium. All those classes
6
met
in
in
the
the same
auditorium.
room. And I started out down on the front row was the juvenile class. That was the little bitty people. And then the girls met up in the choir loft, and they were the willing workers.
Okay.
And the libraries were down below on that front row. And then the women and the older women and men were separated. There was, I don't remember their names.
Faithful Workers was
Was one of
the
them.
women.
But I don't remember the other one.
I don't remember
And
the
then
name
there
of
was
it.
the, I suppose you'd call them the teens or the younger, older people, younger people. That was the SPI class.
Well, the ministry of Sunday school is sure powerful, and
Oh,
you can
yes.
see the benefits of it. Well, we'd like to conclude this segment of our history, and thanks to Lloyd and Pauline Brady for bringing this up to date on some of the more recent things that have happened to Rising Sun Church. Our guest on this segment of Rising Sun Remembers is Marie Dunbar. And Marie, I believe you said your maiden name was Knox.
Right.
So why don't you go back and tell us your connections with the church in terms of your family?
Well, it started years ago when my folks have always been in the church, and my grandparents.
So go straight back to your grandparents.
Go back to my grandparents. my aunt and uncle, and which was Mr. and Mrs. Nick Merle. And of course, my folks was Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Knox, and I had 2 brothers and myself, and we were all baptized here at Rising Sun.
Do you recall offhand, I've asked several of the folks, do you remember the circumstances around your baptism, maybe who the preacher was?
Brother Lowe.
Brother Lowe baptized you. What do you remember about him? I've heard others talk about his ministry here.
Very fine fellow. Enjoyed him very much.
Was your baptism at a protracted meeting, a revival, or was it just a regular Sunday service? Do you
No,
recall?
it was at a revival meeting.
I found that several of the folks that we've talked with have said that the revival meeting happened to be the time when they were baptized. You have mentioned, and Marie has brought us, well, several things, songbooks and pictures, and one of the things that she mentioned to us was the fact that around State Fair time, the church would have a service and a
Yeah.
dinner. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, once a year, at the state fair time, the church would hold their services at the state fairground, and then we would have basket dinner afterwards. And the picture that I have is the one at the time when Brother Lowe was preaching here.
Do you recall offhand about how long he preached here? I've never heard anybody mention that. Would you have any idea?
No, I don't know, but I do know that he was preaching, or was around, I'm sure he was preaching about that time in 1925. Clarence and Francis Stewart and Harlan and Eva Stewart. And on their golden anniversary invitation was where they were married by Brother Lowe.
Okay, so that gets us back into the 20s pretty well when he had his ministry here.
But now I was baptized when I was 12 years old. I was born in 1911, so now then you can kind of figure that out.
Kind of figure out how long that's been. Well, that's a good number of years. And was there anything about the church services in those days that maybe is a little bit different than now that you want to comment on?
Oh, very definitely.
What comes to mind?
Oh, I just tell you what, they just, I think that everybody was closer connected than what they are now. But of course, everybody was old members at that time, and there was a lot of family connections.
I take it the church had lots of families, big families, but lots of them. There wasn't just 1 or 2 predominant
Right.
families. There were several.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose that did make for a closeness that was very special.
Mhm.
I've asked the people too about some social activities, and some have talked about the ice cream and strawberries. In earlier years they talked about the oyster supper. Anything that you recall maybe in the later years, even with the Coliseum and that kind of thing?
Very definitely. They used to always have their, the Ladies' Aid Society was a great part
Okay.
of the church. And they worked very faithful. And they had a big part of it and helped support it. In fact, the case is the carpeting that was put on the church floor over there was bought and paid for by the Ladies' Aid Society.
Oh, that's the old church building you're speaking of.
The old church building, And I remember my mother and Hazel Persons and Rhett Ellis and Bess Meacham was a committee on it.
Oh.
And Rhett said that she put the names of who the committee was and tacked it on the back of it underneath the piano, so not to forget it.
Is that right? I was wondering too, I think you mentioned at one time now, you were married in the old church building, which
Rhett Ellis says that my wedding was the first church wedding. There had been marriages, but it was the first church wedding in the Rising Sun Church.
Oh. And I understand at that time that most people were married either in their home, or their folks' home, or maybe the preacher's home, so that was
Right.
unusual then.
Mhm.
Well, that's interesting.
And that was in 1932.
1932. How, speaking of that era of time, how did the Depression affect the church and the activities of that time?
Well, it was just rough going.
Okay.
And the different ones, and even that they had to pry on the elders and deacons for extra finance.
Just to support the church.
To support the church. And the Ladies' Aid Society played a good part in that, because they used to have chicken suppers and bazaars and things like that, and they was a great support to the church.
Okay. How about some of the special programs like Christmas, Easter, anything that you recall around those?
They always had a big Christmas program and a Christmas tree.
Oh, yeah.
And then at the close of the service, why, they did at one time permit them to bring gifts. Then there was so many that some of them didn't get gifts and one thing and another. And then at the close of the service, they would give them a sack of candy. But now they gave a sack of candy to everybody. Well, then it got to the place where that began to be a little problem. And finally, the last, Fred Meacham and Annabelle Meacham furnished candy for all of the children, but they omitted the older ones.
Oh, I see.
Then they quit it all together. But Christmas was quite a deal.
Special.
And I remember we used to come to church in bobsleds.
Okay, now I talked about transportation a little bit. What was that like?
Oh, they had a regular hitching post out in front, and we used to come and tie the horses up out there and warm bricks and things and put in our bobsled to keep warm while we were going.
Wow. Well, I was just mentioning earlier, we've had such a rough year weather-wise, and yet when you hear stories like this, it makes the weather that we've had seem kind of minimal.
Yes.
People really went through a lot to get to church. I was wondering, too, now I noticed that you brought us several songbooks. I've asked some of the people, are there any hymns that was sung years ago that maybe we don't sing quite as much, or any hymns that stick out in your mind as a youngster growing up in the church that you sang?
Oh, I think we pretty well cover them. There's a lot in there that's not in the new books, but then we wouldn't get new books if it wouldn't have something new.
Well, I know.
The one thing we didn't have all of this rock and roll music in the church then than what we have now, which a lot of people object to.
Music has changed through the years.
Mm-hmm.
What about Sunday school teachers? Any Sunday school teachers that kind of stick out in your mind?
Grandma Weaver.
I've heard many mention her.
She was I can remember we used to sit down right on the front row in church. And she would come in and sit down in front of us, and she had on her full skirt, you know, and she'd just sit down in front of the class. I can just see her coming every Sunday morning.
Is that right?
Uh-huh. And she was a wonderful teacher. And then, of course, as we went down through the years, why then we had a number of different teachers.
Well, I think it's interesting to find that there's been some very definite people that have influenced.
And then Pearl Weaver was the teacher for years of our SPI class. And that was the young people before the married class then.
Oh, okay. Well, at this time, we're grateful for our time with Marie Dunbar and what she's told us about the church. And once again, we hope to do more in the series of Rising Sun Remembers.